Welcome to the Good Divorce Show, where we can help you learn how to navigate the journey of divorce with less conflict, less debt, and equip you not to just get divorced, but also learn how to be divorced. Your host, Certified Divorce Coach Karen McNenny, shares her wealth of knowledge, gets advice from other relationship experts, and interviews couples who learn how to have a good divorce, so you can too. Now here's your host, Karen.
Hello and welcome back to the Good Divorce Show. I am your host, Karen McNenny, and the Good Divorce Coach. And we are here today to provide some financial insight. We are chatting with Ed Vargo. He is the co-founder and CEO of Burning River Advisory Group and Enlighten Her, which is a community focused on financial mentorship for women. With over 20 years in financial services, Ed helps women navigate long-term financial planning for all of life stages, including retirement, college, and transitions related to divorce or death. And we are certainly going to dive into that topic. His dedication is personal. Ed was inspired by his mother's financial struggles after his parents' divorce, and he is committed to empowering women to confidently manage their finances and avoid some of those similar hardships that he saw in his own childhood. He is a member of the Financial Planning Association and the Society of Financial Service Professionals. Ed is married with 5 daughters of his own, aged 18 to 24, whom he has raised to be financially empowered young women. We are so excited here today to welcome you to the show. Hi, Ed.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
You know, we always like to start a little bit about the stepping stones that brought you into this work, specifically working with women who have either in the middle of their own divorce journey or post-divorce. And for our male listeners out there, absolutely, I am sure there is going to be value for you as well. We are not restrictive to a female-only audience, but I know, Ed, that you really have a special soft spot in your heart, given your own experience growing up. So, Ed, if you wouldn't mind taking us back in time to your own experience as a child of divorce and the reflection you have now, not only as an adult, but also as a professional. What have you learned in retrospect from your own experience?
Yeah, when I first started in this business, in this world of financial advice, we didn't start out working with women, which is where we are today. And so when I started to think back, why is that? How did we end up in this space of working predominantly with women? Because we could choose a lot of different pathways. And I think it does start with me growing up. And I look back at my mom's situation, and my mom and my father got divorced when I was young, probably 9 or 10 years old. And my mom, she was an immigrant from South Korea, didn't read the language, write the language, had never driven. And many of those things are still true today. So when she was approaching divorce, she was at a real disadvantage when it comes to the nuances of how to navigate a divorce properly. And the long and the short of it was she didn't know what she was doing. And unfortunately, it ended up costing her custody of her 4 children. And so, it was a little unconventional. I mean, divorce back then wasn't as common as it is today. And even more unconventional to where my father had sole custody of us 4 kids. But as I look back on that, I started to think about the impact that had on my mother. When you're young, you don't really understand that. Even as a young adult,
Sure.
I didn't understand it. And as I started to grow up and have my family of my own, I started to realize just how awful that must have been and how devastating for a mother to have to give up custody of her children. And for that reason, really, it came down to economically, she didn't feel like she was going to be in a position to care for us. And there were some cultural, barriers there as well. But economically, she just didn't feel like she could do it. And she didn't know the system well enough to know that maybe she could have gotten child support or maybe some alimony, and to where that economics didn't have to be the barrier that it was. And so that's the root of my divorce story, is looking back and seeing what my mother went through. And what that does is it's shaped the lens from which I view the world moving forward, because I have 5 daughters of my own.
Yeah.
It's that sort of tale of 2 cities, the best of times, the worst of times. And I think about my mother's situation being the worst of times, and I think of my girls as trying to make it the best of times and prepare them to be able to, go out into the world and be formidable, empowered women. And a big part of that is being financially savvy and strong and not letting that be the barrier it was for my mother.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just have to ask, because personal stories are such a hallmark here on the Good Divorce Show. What kind of contact did you have with your mom growing up then?
It was different for each of us. I was probably the last one to come around. I felt, quite frankly, quite a bit of resentment. Sort of that immature child, my mother left us or abandoned us or that kind of thing. And so it was a few years before I came around and had real consistent contact or even just started to bridge, mend that bridge. My siblings came around a little bit sooner than me for sure. But it took a while because I harbored some resentment. I felt, you can imagine a young child at that time trying to interpret what was happening around him, not getting much information from either side. It took a while. And then, but by the time I got back into college and, the relationship had come full circle. And then it's been a really great relationship ever since then.
And I'm curious what your mom says about that time, what her version of the story is why she wasn't present and what actually happened in court. What your dad's version of the story, we hear people talk a lot about, um, parent alienation, tight custody. Like you said, this was, many decades ago. We know better now. So here is where we're trying to help people to do better. But I'm sure there were two different conflicting stories coming from both of your parents, perchance. And I'm curious what they were and what you now know as an adult parent yourself.
Sure. Well, there was a major power imbalance in terms of the relationship. Of course, my father was from the United States, right? So he didn't have any of the cultural barriers, whether it's the language or getting a job, etc. So there was a lot of power that was sort of weighed on his side that he could wield. And I'm not saying he did this per se, sort of wield it as a weapon, but my mother did not understand what her legal options were that were
Right.
available to her were, right? She just wasn't able to ascertain that type of information. And again, there's two parts of this story. There's part that just, again, coming from a different culture and being a little bit, in this case, a bit more passive around, what she can and should do. But then there's the practical realities. My father was the one who went to work. He had knowledge of the legal system, at least more so than my mother. His personality was also very dominating. He had a very strong, dominating personality. He was a military policeman. That's how they met. They met in Korea when he was stationed over there.
Mhm.
And so, not that my mother was a wallflower, because she definitely wasn't that. But the reality is there was this major imbalance of power, and he utilized that to get what he wanted. And that makes it sound awful. I'm sure it's more nuanced and complicated than that. But that's in essence what happened. He was able to wield that power in a way that put my mother in a situation where she felt like she had no option. And if she had known better, right? So if we were to fast forward today, and if I was in a position to advise her, let's say I was her son advising her in this situation, it would be a very different outcome because obviously I have a much greater sense of understanding of how this works, but I could help shepherd her along, point her in the right direction, and make her feel like she has some control where she felt hopeless.
Yes. Well, let's take that model of really envisioning your mom and all the moms out there who might find themselves, um, as the unmoneyed person in the relationship or the one who has less financial power or knowledge. And so you've identified several ways in which women kind of get off on the wrong foot in their divorce proceedings. Could you unpack that a little more for us?
Sure. What I find is that not unlike a lot of other areas, but in particular divorce, people come in with a lot of preconceived notions. They have this idea of how they think it should go without really having a good understanding of how the whole process works. And so there's multiple barriers. And I think if I had to start with one place, is to say, take a step back and get a better understanding of the divorce process and the elements that go into it. And so I think there is a narrow focus depending upon the lens of that person. So as an example, let's say you're concerned about the money side. So you're laser focused on the money side and you forget a little bit, at least, that there's a legal proceeding here, but also there's an emotional side to this. Or you might come in and feel very emotional about the proceedings and how am I going to handle all of this? And sort of that emotional element overwhelms you or it dominates your mindset, forgetting again or playing second fiddle are the legal ramifications and the financial ramifications of this decision. And the reality is, and what makes divorce so difficult, and one of the most unique challenges that I see as a financial practitioner, is these three elements coming together. You really do have to be knowledgeable and strong in the areas of finance, in the legal process of divorce, and in the self-regulation or your own self-health, whether it's emotional well-being, physical well-being. And you need to do that all on a high level at one of the most difficult and challenging and emotionally charged times of your life.
It
So
is
it's no
important.
wonder that divorce causes so many issues, right? And it has such a long, far-reaching impact on people, even years and maybe decades after the fact.
Absolutely. And certainly with the clients that I guide, I really built the business I needed when I went through my divorce over a decade ago, which exactly as you said, someone who's going to hold all of those things simultaneously with me, not just a lawyer who's going to try to divide finances, but touch in with that emotional journey, with the grief of the loss, of knowing the big picture. And as you said, there's a long tail to divorce, particularly if there are children are involved. The marriage might be dissolving, but not the relationship. If you share children, you have a forever relationship that is going to span from graduations to grandbabies and weddings and beyond. So I really appreciate your kind of holistic approach in knowing that there's more than a spreadsheet that we're dealing with here. But let me ask about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's one of those things that isn't so obvious. When you get into a conversation, let's say, and I'm going to stereotype a little bit here, but this has been my experience in terms of, let's say you're speaking with the attorney and you're going through the process, right? And so it's been my experience that attorneys are very good tacticians. Technical analysts, right? They're good tacticians. They understand the legal process. They have a pretty good understanding of the financial process as well. And they operate in this spreadsheet world. And that's why we're hiring them, right? To operate in this spreadsheet world, right? Divide these assets, help me understand this legal process. However, where we live our lives, we don't live our lives on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper or a spreadsheet. And so there's oftentimes things get lost in translation from the attorney to the client because the client obviously is coming at this with a very emotional or from an emotional lens. I'm not saying overly emotional, but you can't deny that there's an emotional element to it. And then you have these cold hard facts. And so there's oftentimes a big disconnect between the attorney and client relationship as a result of that. And I don't think and I share this because I think most clients, at least the most female clients that we've seen step into divorce, that can be jarring, right? I think they expect, this is part of that preconceived notions, I think they expect that their attorney is going to be a bit more, I won't say like their therapist is going to put their arm around them, but a bit more like that, a little bit more warm, a bit more empathetic and understanding. And I'm not saying there aren't divorce attorneys out there like that,
Right.
but if you need that and you expect that, you need to go find that person because not all of the divorce attorneys out there are like that.
And I think finding the right fit. I say it's like shopping for shoes, ladies. You should try on a couple pairs before you walk out of the store and make sure you have a good fit. And I echo so much of your sentiment, Ed. And to the credit of lawyers, they're trained to do a thing, which is to fight for their client to get as much as possible, which is why the cooperative and the collaborative world of divorce, and really what I do as a divorce consultant, again, we're trying to find individuals like you, the right real estate person, therapist, mediation, like wraparound services so that you recognize, listeners, the lawyer is not the only person on your team. You are going to need more individuals to guide you through a process, and those lawyers will help you get legally divorced, but it is unlikely they're going to support you to know how to be divorced, which is the story that you are starting to write anew, and as you renovate, not destroy, but renovate that primary relationship that you're leaving. I really appreciate that spirit, Ed. And when we come back from the break, we're going to hear some specific case studies that will hopefully fill in the gaps for you listeners as you consider your own financial future, as well as how you navigate that through the process. We're chatting today with Ed Vargo of Burning River Advisory Group and Enlighten Her, which again is that community-focused financial mentorship community for women. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Are you thinking about getting divorced? Before you call a lawyer, call the Good Divorce Coach, Karen McNenny, a certified divorce counselor, co-parenting specialist, and mediator. Karen's signature Good Divorce experience will guide you through your divorce journey, from the day you make that difficult decision to the day the decree is signed, all for a predictable fee. The Good Divorce Coach will teach you and your partner how to get divorced and be divorced with less conflict and less debt. Visit thegooddivorcecoach.com to get in touch with Karen.
Now, back to the show with Karen.
Welcome back to the Good Divorce Show. I am Karen McNenny, your Good Divorce Coach. Thanks for setting aside time for yourself today to really think about how you want to navigate your own divorce experience. And today we're chatting with Ed Vargo. He is the co-founder and CEO of Burning River Advisory Group. He also has a financial mentorship program for women called Enlighten Her. We're going to hear a little bit more about that. And just knowing that, with us today, we have not just a financial analyst, but a CDFA, a Certified Divorce Financial Analyst, which means Ed not only is going to look at the spreadsheet, but he's going to look at the person behind the spreadsheet. Thanks again for joining us, Ed.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
I'm curious what you have seen by way of transformation and how you empower women in the process. And if there's any particular story that comes to mind of somebody who has really taken their divorce experience, not as a path to shrinking, but really as a path to growth.
Yeah, I think that happens in a lot of cases. And the one that most readily comes to mind is we were working with this lady who she initiated the divorce. So that was the first step, is she took action to initiate the divorce, which was a big thing for her. She had been thinking about it for a long time, I think literally years. She was trying to find her way to be able to make this decision. And her husband had talked back and forth about divorce, kind of passively, but and we met her before she actually officially filed for divorce. And it was one of those situations where our guidance to her was like, look, the reality is, if you don't do this, it's never going to get done. And she echoed that, like she knew her husband wasn't going to initiate a divorce. He probably wasn't going to fight her on the divorce either, but he would have been fine sort of living in this, purgatory, so to speak, for however long. And
Yes.
so she finally just said, I can't do this any longer. And it took, again, a while for her to get to that point. She had a lot of support behind her. I would like to think we're part of that support structure that helped her make that decision, provide some clarity to her. And she finally initiated made that decision to, I need to file for divorce. And it was this journey that she went on of basically being rather passive in terms of the process. I don't think she was, again, a wallflower, so to speak, but she wasn't prone to make these types of big decisions. That wasn't how her relationship was designed, really. That's how they grew up. They were together for a long time. He took charge of the big picture items, and she kind of went along with it. And it worked for a long time until it didn't, until his decisions were serving his needs, but not hers. And so, but this divorce was a big step, right? And so there was a lot of sort of guilt that went with it. A lot of, am I doing the right thing? I know I'm doing the right thing. Am I doing the right thing? This back and forth, questioning her own morality is, should I be doing this? Am I giving up on the relationship, on the marriage? And I think her story isn't unusual. It's certainly coming to the point where we say, when a person says, I no longer can be in this relationship, in this marriage, it takes a lot to get there. And there's a lot of guilt oftentimes that goes with it. And then after the guilt, there's, can I do it? So financially, can I live on my own? I haven't worked in a long time. Am I going to be at his beck and call? Is he going to use this process against me? So on and so forth, right? But basically, throughout this process, you could just see the growth, though. It took a while to get through it. It was probably an 18-month process to get through the divorce, from filing to exiting on the other side. But you could see as she went further and further, right? She had a little bit of confidence, which they got more confidence and accelerated this confidence, and it just grew and grew and grew. And by the end of it, I remember even saying this to her, it's like, I don't recognize the person in front of me today from the person who first sat down with me. And it was a positive comment. So
Yeah.
much, growth and development. And she started out with sort of like a lot of trepidation and despair, and she walked out of it on the other side feeling much more confident about her next stage in life. So it went from focusing on what was or what might have been to what will be, but she was the one controlling what that next step was going to be. And I love those stories. I mean, I love being a part of that. If I had to say what really drives me or what gives me the most satisfaction is really just that, is helping somebody find their voice, to find a way to advocate for themselves, especially standing up to the bullies that are out there as well. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of bullies in the divorce arena, and I hate when they get their way. It's a little
I,
my own passion. Yeah,
me
I
too. I
really
don't like to see the bullies win. Just
no.
people kind of give up. They will not yield, right? That's part of their wiring. So the only way to really get clear is to have the firmest of boundaries and commitment, to advocate for self, right? Because
Yep.
they're not interested in advocating or yielding for you.
No, and I think there's this thought that we're going to find the best of this person. The best of this person that I'm divorcing is going to come out, that they're going to take care of me, or they're not going to put their own interests first. And it's great to think that way, but you've got to be prepared to fight and to stand up for yourself. And oftentimes that sentiment is just kind of pie in the sky thinking. It just is.
Yeah.
So you can think like that, but you have to be able to plan and stand up for yourself. And when you're dealing with the bully, it's cliche, but you have to stand up to the bully and do
Yeah.
it the right way. It doesn't mean you come at them with the same tactics that they come at you. It's being true to yourself, true to your own morality and your own ethics, but doing it in the right way. And you can do that and stand up for yourself and get what you deserve out of the process of divorce or ending your marriage. So,
Mhm.
that always comes to mind, just like the transformation of, from point A to point, Z on the spectrum, and then what her trajectory is going forward. And I got to say, things, divorce after the fact, she's probably 3 or 4 years into it. Um, she's doing great. It's really awesome and amazing. And it's just a stark difference from where she started.
How rewarding for you and your team. And as you relay that story, particularly the part about her really grappling with the decision and what it will mean and what the fallout from that should be, and can I afford it? And I just want to remind you, listeners, that you're not alone in that place of purgatory. Those of you who are still pondering how to do this, and anybody on the outside who says, oh, they're just getting divorced, they're taking the easy way out, they just gave up. My experience, it could not be further from the truth. People grapple with this for, I would say, often too long, because if destruction is starting to happen in the house, the emotional destruction, the volatility, the hostility, chances are you should have taken that off ramp a little bit earlier. And in the Good Divorce Experience, we do say, can you see that off ramp and come to a conscious, intentional decision together that is not so adversarial from the get go, and then be guided through that. The other thing that I heard you really talking about was, her planning. Can I afford to do this? So what advice would you give, Ed, for someone who now is like, okay, the D word has been spoken. We're probably going down that path, maybe even before a lawyer's call, but what kind of preparation, information gathering, and considerations should individuals be taking as they look through the financial lens of divorce?
That's a big question, actually. What I would say is you always want to start out with know what you have, know your entire financial picture, at least gather all the information. You may not know exactly what's in it, but whether you're working with an attorney or a financial advisor or doing this on your own, you need to know in totality everything that you own, all of the assets that you have, all the income that's coming into the household, and then all of the liabilities, and then the investments, etc. You need to know the full picture of your financial life. Now, you may not have the technical expertise to understand everything in front of you, but again, regardless if you decide to get professional support or do it yourself, you need to have that information.
Mhm.
And then from there is you need to know how divorce law works in your state, and maybe even specific to your county. Like in Ohio, each county is different. And so I would start to narrow my focus in terms of, okay, well, I'm in Cuyahoga County in Cleveland, Ohio. What is the court system? How does the court system typically look at splitting of assets, paying of alimony, paying of child support? And there are, it might be easier or more difficult depending upon where you live to get that information, but it's out there. And it doesn't mean you're going to get the exact answer, but you should be able to narrow it down from, 10 different ways or 50 different ways down to a few different ways to look at your case. And depending upon the complexity of your situation, your own level of understanding of the financial world, you might want to go out. You can do this stuff yourself, perhaps. I always think it's a little dubious because it is kind of a quagmire, a legal and financial quagmire, but it would put you in a position to be better prepared to when you go to interview those attorneys who can help you. And that's one of the big things. And I know this isn't really your question, but in terms of how to work more efficiently with an attorney, keep your costs down, find the right attorney, the more prepared you are going into that conversation, the better you're going to be at keeping your expenses down, right? You're not asking your attorney questions that you can answer for yourself, because at $200 to $500 an hour, that's very expensive to ask those questions. You'll know better not to use your attorney as a therapist. And then the biggest expense that you will avoid is hiring the wrong attorney. And so I start off by saying this is a big question. It is a big question, but gathering as much all of your financial information as you possibly can. And in some relationships, it may be hard to get that information, right? Because your husband is hiding it. And so that's a whole nother conversation.
Gonna say and to dig in a little deeper, because I'm sure there is someone listening to you today thinking, I don't even know where it all is, or I know it's there, but I don't have passwords, or it's two person. Like, there are some people who cannot access that information. And
Right.
of course, we hope that there would be an easy stepping stone cooperatively with your soon to be former spouse of like, hey, I need all the accounts, I need all the passwords, we need to sit down, we need to together. But that's not always the case. So what levers and avenues do people have if they fear that there's money not being disclosed, or that they just can't even get to the information because someone will not share account numbers or passwords?
Sure. And this happens way more often than it should. So,
Yeah.
and you can't wave a magic wand to make that go away. So I think you have to evaluate your own situation at home. Obviously, you never want to put yourself at risk by finding this information, because if that relationship is perhaps verbally or physically abusive, you have to tread lightly, because people are funny about money, right? And they're very
Yeah.
protective about dollars. So understand your situation first and foremost. At the furthest end of the spectrum, you do have the protections of the courts. So as an example, if your husband is not able to or willing to turn over any of his financial information, just refuses, and you can't get it any other way, right? Just physically, you can't get your hands on the data. Well, at that point, you're going to have to invoke the courts. You file for divorce, and they can issue subpoenas, which is basically a court order that demands him to turn over this information. And in fact, they may go directly to the financial institutions themselves and say, if you have any records on this person, they need to turn them over. That's an expensive process. It is fairly effective, and it may be your only recourse, because if he absolutely refuses and you can't get it in any other way, what are you going to do, right? So the courts will step in and can intervene in that process. Before that, certainly you want to try and, not go that furthest extreme, gather as much information as you can. And you can get started on that process, like your tax return. If you get a tax return, you might be surprised at how much information can be deduced from what's in there. Okay, so
Oh,
in
that's a great tip. So you
yeah,
mean reaching out to the IRS for even past years, that if the taxes are filed under, your name and your spouse's name, you have a legal right to get those. Even if you didn't see them before they were filed, you can request them at this time. And that can be a really good lens of the financial landscape, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have an accountant that, who prepared the taxes for you, you can go directly to the accountant. The accountant can't say, oh, well, your husband said I can't give you this information. Nope, that's not how it works. If you don't have an accountant or you don't know who that accountant is and you can't get the information, you can go directly to the IRS and request a transcript of the tax return that was filed. And it's going to take a little bit more understanding to be able to interpret that document. It's not as user friendly, but you can get the information from there, and it is a gateway to other areas of your financial life. So the thing about finance is there's a paper trail, and the tax return is sort of a gathering of all that information, and then it can take you down these different pathways and piece it all back together if you know what you're doing. And so there's a whole slew, and there's a whole cottage industry in divorce called forensic accounting for divorce, which allows you to trace back all these different, accounts, which is a whole nother, can of worms to step into. But the reality is, knowledge is power, probably more so in divorce than any other field that I've seen, because you need knowledge of the legal process and how that whole thing works. You need knowledge of the financial process. And unless you're going to the courts directly, there's no one out there looking no one looking out for you, excuse me. There's no one looking out for you. There's no white knight coming in to save you. And even then, the courts aren't white knights to save you but there are some things that they can do that you can't do on your own. But getting the proper guidance, and the more complicated your case is, the more you're going to need professional support, and maybe across different disciplines.
Yeah. And I'm going to just highlight again what you mentioned, a forensic accountant. And a lot of CPA firms or independent individuals who work in tax law, who work around in the world of divorce, would have those credentials and the know-how. And we hope that you don't have to go digging. But if you suspect that something is not being disclosed, things don't add up, purchases have been made, maybe you've got a spouse who operates a lot in cash, which is harder to track, then a forensic accountant might be another one of those team members to support you, and someone like Ed as your financial advisor. And Ed, I also want you to dig in just a little bit to the CDFA designation, the Certified Divorce Financial Analyst, and why someone might want to look for that designation and what specifically you can do for clients.
Sure. When I first started down this path of considering, do we want to do this divorce work or not? It was a real decision. We came to a fork in the road because we had a bunch of cases. We kept seeing women coming to us post-divorce, meaning they've already had legal representation in most cases. And we kept seeing what I would call subpar financial settlements. I'm like, walk me through how you came to this conclusion, why you chose, this. And he said, well, I worked with my attorney and, he or she said this or that. And so I realized that we were coming to these cases a little late. And so we either had to be okay with that. We had one of two choices. This is that proverbial fork in the road. We could either continue to operate as is, work with and help these women post-divorce and just kind of try to clean up what was left over, or we could try to get on the front end, which is a much harder path, by the way. Get on the front end of this, avoid some of it, and craft a better settlement.
The hard path is after the fact.
Well, a harder path for us would have been before the fact, in the sense that as a financial professional running a business, we would need to learn a whole other discipline in finance. So this is where the CDFA comes in.
Yep.
So as a financial professional, I would say most of us don't have a CDFA, right? Certified Divorce Financial Analyst designation. And so when women come to us, or men or women come to us post-divorce, we're able to handle that very readily, right? The settlement's already happened. Here are my assets. Here's my income. And then we can pick up the pieces and then move forward from there. Mm-hmm. So as a practitioner, it's no different than any other case that we're working on, right? There's nothing in flux. We have what we have and we're going to move forward. On the other hand, if you're trying to get on the front end of this, what you're basically trying to do is help somebody craft a settlement. So you really need to know not just the financials of divorce, which is a whole nother thing you have to learn, but you also have to know how the legal process works. And that's a whole other discipline, and time spent there. You have to develop relationships. And then you have this emotional side, which just makes it so much harder because you're dealing with people who are compromised in many cases emotionally, or it's a bigger challenge. So as a practitioner, when we decided to put on that CDFA hat or be on the front end of this, it really is a massive decision. And we have to change entirely how we run our business, at least for this divorce piece. So a lot harder.
Yeah.
But because the economics or the role of the CDFA is to, in my opinion, part of the role is to help a person decide on the proper settlement, how to look at the entire picture, how to split assets, and how to craft the right strategy in working with the attorney, to present it to the court or to the other side. And so the CDFA is classically trained in the financials of divorce, and it's completely different than regular normal rank and file. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is because, unlike, let's say, estate planning, which has pretty rigid rules like of engagement, here's how X works to Y works to Z. In the world of divorce, there are more guidelines. There aren't hard, set, fast rules in many cases. And so the caliber of your counsel is so important there, because it's like you would think in any legal case, right? The quality of your attorney matters. And that's very true here, but the quality of your financial advisor matters as well, because that's the person who's typically, working in conjunction with the attorney to craft the right settlement. So it's very different, though. The CDFA is trained in the economics of divorce, which again is very different than just rank and file standard.
And does that credential, is it bound by state? Like, are you able to help somebody in Nebraska or only in Ohio?
No, the CDFA is I'm gonna say it's a national designation, but it's a designation on the advisor. And then whether that advisor can work with others in other states falls under different rules and regulations. So like if I'm registered by the SEC, which I am, for me to work with somebody else in securities in another state, I have to be licensed in that state. But the CDFA, works across all 50.
Wonderful. And as we start to go to a close, before I ask you our last question, can you just remind our listeners where they can find you and your firm and Enlighten Her and all the resources and support that you have available, Ed?
I think the best place to start would be to go to enlightenher.com. That is sort of the community outreach or support arm of it. We have two sister businesses. There's Burning River Advisory Group, which is my wealth management business, much more narrowly focused, more traditional, comprehensive financial planning based. For this conversation, I think in general, Enlighten Her is the place to start. We have all of our divorce specific information there. We have a great course that we just put out. And if I could say so, I think it's unique in the, in the industry. It's basically, we brought together two divorce attorneys, two divorce coaches / therapists, and two financial advisors, myself and my business partner. And we're talking about each of the pieces, the three-legged stool of divorce, which is legal, financial, and then mental health. And we put that together in a course that you can go through at your own discretion and help you navigate and guide your way through this. It is broken up into two tracks. Like, one is for someone who is maybe just thinking about divorce as a possibility at the very front end of this, because usually divorce is a long process, taken over many, many years. And so when you first have this thought, maybe this is in my future, you want to get educated about it. It's not giving up on your marriage. It's not saying this is going to happen, but something this complicated, the sooner you can understand how the divorce world works, the better. And then the second course is really for someone who's like, okay, I've thought about this long enough. It's going to happen. Or if it's thrust upon you, it's like, I'm going to actively plan for divorce. So it's not just about getting knowledge. It's about taking tangible steps, real steps to prepare yourself and to take that advantage away or even the playing field. And so enlightenher.com is the best place to go for all that information.
Enlighten Her, and we'll be sure that's in our show notes. And are there associated fees with the two courses that you identified?
The course, they are a paid for course, but there's a great white paper that we created as well with no cost. It's like 12 steps to emotional and financial well-being. I might be getting that exactly wrong, but not exactly right. But that's a great guide. It's free. It's quite comprehensive with action steps. I think one of the things I appreciate about working with women, I'm not saying men don't do this either, but women in particular, I found they're like, okay, tell me what I need to know and how to do it, or
Mhm.
what's the next step. And so that 12 steps guide, it really is designed to say, okay, here's some things to think about, but also here's some action steps that you can take to move the ball forward versus just getting knowledge and getting more information, but not really doing anything with it.
That's fantastic. And I really appreciate what you said about just because you're investigating and learning about how divorce works doesn't mean you're going to get divorced. But we are negligent as a society because marriage, it's really easy to get married. And we spend lots of time planning weddings and all sorts of details. And I really think people can design their divorce and again, come at it with greater intention. And as you said, it's so important to just become knowledgeable. So thank you for adding all of those resources and making those available, not only to our listening audience here on the Good Divorce Show, but to the broader community across the US. Let me just, in closing, ask you this, Ed, as you talk about this journey, what has surprised you in your practice?
There are two things in particular. One's more technical and then one's more personal, I guess. One of the biggest technical surprises is how often the client and the attorney don't get along, their own attorney.
Mm,
This is,
wow.
again, I never expected this. I never expected there to be so much, um, I won't say antagonism, but there's so much not being on the same page between the client and the attorney that she hired. I've heard some of the worst things said about professionals about how attorneys talk to their clients, how they treat them.
Mm,
I just wasn't ready for that. And I don't mean to paint with broad strokes and say divorce attorneys are these mean people and they do these mean things. But I will tell you that this is more than anecdotal. And I have my own reasons and thoughts about why that is. Some falls on the shoulders of the attorney, some falls on the shoulders of the client. I always err on the side of the attorney, the professional. They should know better, right?
you should
Like
know.
if I'm constantly having problems with my clients, that falls on me as a professional because I should know better. But anyway, that's one big thing. So finding the right attorney and having that person advocate for you and be on your side is so important. Just don't assume that that's the case. You really need to find that good fit. And the other side is, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Karen, is that the lasting impact of divorce in someone's life. That's been really interesting for me to see. I was talking with somebody who helps us in a professional capacity in the divorce space. She was divorced 15 years ago. And when she's talking about her divorce and then the emotions that come forth 15 years later, right? She's in a whole completely different space. Great
Yep.
life. Things are going very well. But that time in her life is still very emotional to her today. So but she's in a very different place now, in a great place. So I think divorce is something that always sort of leaves a mark, but it doesn't have to define who you are and define where you're going. And there are some challenges with people kind of getting stuck and they can't get past their divorce. And so there's a little bit of that you have to be mindful of, but it's a relatively brief amount of time in your life to go through divorce for so much more after it. So, we're focused on the after of it and creating this new great life for yourself and giving yourself the best possible existence for you on this next stage of your life journey.
Which is just absolutely spot on. And, I always tell the clients that I'm guiding through this entire process, every step along the way is, I work for your children. They're actually my clients, and I'm here to protect your future, not fix your past. That's done. And there is a long future ahead. In fact, I am compelled to ask about your own parents' journey by way of providing some hope and recognition that things can also change over time. And as you mentioned, there was quite a contentious relationship and a lot of separation between children and parents. So catch us up. What's the epilogue to your own family of divorce story, Ed?
Sure. I appreciate you asking, first of all. My father's no longer with us, but he died a few years ago. But yeah, you're right. At the start, obviously, he got divorced for a reason, quite contentious. quite verbal in outwardly. But, what was really gratifying over the years is that they found a way to put all that aside. I have my 5 daughters, and of course we have a lot of family functions when you have that many kiddos running around, and they were all young at the same time. And so, we'd invite my mom and my dad, of course, to these events, and, their relationship really just got better and better and better. And I don't know how long it took, but they, at some point you wonder, like, well, how did these two ever get divorced? It's like, because they got along so well. They had, just a great relationship thereafter. And I mean, you never would have thought that these two, had any strife between them. So they're even in some of these really bad relationships. And I remember the battles as a child, and just how, verbally, I shouldn't say verbally abusive, but how vocal they were as a young person, seeing that. And then to have them, kind of come full circle and put all that behind them and come together, it gives you hope in a lot of different ways. Because if they can do it, gosh, I mean, I think most people should spring eternal in those cases as well.
Absolutely. Every divorce, well, I'm going to paint with a broad brush. It starts with a love story, actually, of two people coming together and choosing to weave their worlds and then their DNA. And I believe children come from love as well. And we don't have to discard all of the goodness that existed in order to just unravel the marriage, to just get unmarried. And for those of you, looking ahead, and as Ed said, eventually their relationship really transformed and they became good friends and supportive. And I hear this often, and time is an elixir that cannot be replaced by anything else. But I do believe each of us has some control of the gas pedal and the brakes. And we can choose to stop tapping the brakes with our former spouse. And if it's going to get better eventually, well, let's just start that part sooner than later. That is a choice and a recognition. And I celebrate that for your family and your children, and most importantly, both of your parents, so that they could come and enjoy their grandchildren, not as adversaries, but just simply as grandparents. Your story's beautiful, Ed. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks again for having me. I've enjoyed it.
And listeners, if you are in the journey of divorce, again, invite you to go to the Good Divorce Coach, as well as enlighten her, so that you can find a path to your own viable story that doesn't have to wait an eternity for it to get better. You can start that now. And remember, everything will be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end.
Thanks for listening. Do you have questions or thoughts about this week's episode? Let us know by following the Good Divorce Coach on Facebook and Instagram at Good Divorce Coach, and leave a comment. And be sure to tune in every Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific, or listen anytime wherever you get your podcasts.